pride. To some, it is a virtuous source of strength, dignity, and self-respect. But what happens when pride curdles into something toxic? When it becomes a mask for a hatred so deep, so personal, that it can no longer be contained within the silent halls of a grand estate. Today, we step across the threshold of a world defined by old money and rigid hierarchies. A world where the line between mistress and maid is as absolute as law. But we will discover that beneath the veneer of civility and decorum, a secret, ugly war was being waged. This is the story of a wealthy widow, her young maid, and a single, suffocating act of violence that exposed a lifetime of hidden hatred. Before we unlock the secrets of the formidable Blackwood Manor, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the intricate mysteries we unravel each and every week. Now, pour yourself a cup of tea, but be careful who serves it, as we delve into the chilling case of Eleanor Vance and the maid who knew too much. Blackwood Manor didn't just sit on the landscape. It commanded it. Perched atop a hill overlooking the misty, winding river, the house was a formidable statement of Victorian Gothic architecture, its dark stone facade and pointed gables seeming to scowl down at the modern world below. It was a place where time had seemingly stood still, preserved in the amber of immense, inherited wealth. The estate belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Vance, a widow in her late 60s whose name was synonymous with old-world society, philanthropy, and an unyielding, almost terrifying, sense of propriety. Eleanor Vance was as much a fixture of the manor as the ancient oaks that lined its driveway. Tall and slender, with a ramrod-straight posture that defied her age, she moved through the cavernous rooms with a silent, regal authority. Her silver hair was always impeccably coiffed, her bespoke silk dresses never showing so much as a wrinkle. Her late husband, a titan of industry, had left her with a fortune that could fund a small nation, but more importantly, he had left her with the Vance name, a legacy she guarded with the ferocity of a dragon protecting its hoard. To the outside world, she was the epitome of grace and control. But to those within the walls of Blackwood Manor, her control was a suffocating force, a constant, silent pressure to be perfect, to be invisible, to never, ever step out of line. Her staff, a small, aging retinue, understood this implicitly. There was Mr. Gable, the butler, who had served the Vances for over 50 years and whose face had become a permanent mask of polite neutrality. There was Mrs. Davies, the cook, whose culinary talents were legendary but who rarely spoke above a whisper. They were all cogs in the meticulously maintained machine of Eleanor's life, their individual identities subsumed by their roles. And then there was Clara. Clara Lawson was an anomaly at Blackwood Manor. At 23, she was a splash of vibrant youth in a world of muted grays and browns. She had arrived 2 years prior, a quiet, unassuming girl from a working-class town, recommended for the position of personal maid to Mrs. Vance. She was diligent, quick to learn, and possessed a preternatural ability to anticipate Mrs. Vance's needs before they were even voiced. She learned how to draw the perfect bath, how to press the newspaper just so, how to arrange the silver-backed brushes on the vanity in the precise order her mistress preferred. To anyone watching, the relationship between Eleanor and Clara appeared to be the model of benevolent aristocracy. Mrs. Vance would occasionally bestow a small, condescending smile upon the girl, a gesture that the other staff recognized as the highest form of praise. Clara, in turn, was the picture of devotion, her demeanor always respectful, her eyes always cast downward. She was pretty, with warm chestnut hair that she kept tied in a simple bun and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to miss nothing. It was this intelligence, this quiet observance, that set her apart. While the other servants moved with the ingrained deference of their station, Clara moved with a watchful stillness. She saw the flicker of rage in Mrs. Vance's eyes when a teacup was placed a millimeter off-center. She heard the veiled contempt in her voice when speaking of new money. She felt the bone-deep chill of the woman's loneliness in the dead of night. The morning Clara's body was discovered began with an uncharacteristic breach of protocol. Mrs. Vance's morning tea, which was to be delivered to her bedside at precisely 7 o'clock, never arrived. At 7:15, An unheard of delay, Eleanor Vance emerged from her bedroom, her silk dressing gown tied tightly, her face a mask of cold fury. She swept down the grand staircase, her slippers making no sound on the thick Persian runner. She found Mr. Gable in the hall, polishing silver with a methodical rhythm. "Gable," she said, her voice like the crack of a whip. "Where is the girl? Where is my tea?" Mr. Gable, startled, looked up at the grandfather clock. "I do not know, madam. Clara is never late. I will go and check on her." The staff quarters were in the East Wing, a stark, functional part of the house that was a world away from the gilded opulence of the West Wing. Clara's room was at the very end of the hall. It was small, neat, and sparsely furnished. Mr. Gable knocked softly on the door. "Clara?" There was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. "Clara, Mrs. Vance is asking for you." Silence. After a moment's hesitation, he turned the knob. The door was unlocked. He pushed it open and peered inside. The room was dim, the heavy curtains drawn against the morning light. Clara was in her bed, lying on her back, the covers pulled up neatly to her chin. For a moment, Gable thought she was simply in a deep sleep, and a surge of irritation on his mistress's behalf went through him. But the stillness in the room was absolute. There was no gentle rise and fall of her chest. Her face, visible in the sliver of light from the hallway, was pale and peaceful, but it was the peace of a marble statue, not of a sleeping girl. "Clara?" he whispered, his voice trembling. He took a step into the room, then another. He reached out and touched her cheek. It was cold, profound, unnatural cold. A gasp caught in his throat. He stumbled back, his hand flying to his mouth, the years of rigid composure deserting him. He turned and fled the room, his hurried footsteps echoing down the long, silent corridor. The arrival of the police shattered the funereal quiet of Blackwood Manor. Two detectives, a man and a woman, stepped out of an unmarked sedan. Detective Frank Miller was a 20-year veteran of the force, a man with a weary, seen-it-all demeanor and a mind like a steel trap. His partner, Detective Lena Hansen, was younger, sharper, with an eye for detail and a knack for seeing the emotional currents that flowed beneath the surface of a crime scene. They were met by a perfectly composed Eleanor Vance. She sat in her drawing room, a cup of tea finally in her hand, her expression one of measured sorrow. "It's a terrible tragedy," she said, her voice steady. "The poor girl. The doctor believes it was her heart. A congenital condition, he suspects. She seemed so healthy." Miller and Hansen exchanged a look. They had already spoken to the first responding paramedics and the family Dr. Mrs. Vance had summoned. The doctor, an elderly man who had been the Vance family physician for 40 years, had indeed suggested a sudden cardiac event. The scene in Clara's room was pristine. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of forced entry, nothing out of place. It was, on the surface, a tragic but unremarkable death of a young woman with a previously undiagnosed medical issue. But Detective Hansen felt a prickle of unease. It was all too neat. The room was not just tidy. It was sterile. Clara's bedside table held a book, a glass of water, and nothing else. Her modest wardrobe was perfectly organized. It was the room of someone who was either obsessively neat or whose room had been tidied. "Mrs. Vance, can you tell us about your relationship with Clara?" Hansen asked, her tone gentle. "She was my maid," Eleanor stated, as if that explained everything. "A very good one, efficient, quiet. She knew her place." The phrase hung in the air, cold and sharp. "And what was her place, ma'am?" Miller asked, his pen hovering over his notepad. "To serve," Eleanor replied without a trace of irony. "She did her job and she was compensated for it. I believe I was a fair employer. I even gave her one of my old cashmere shawls last winter. She was always so grateful." The memory was offered not as an act of kindness, but as proof of her own magnanimity. The detectives proceeded to interview Mr. Gable and Mrs. Davies. Their stories painted a slightly different picture. "Clara was a good girl," Mrs. Davies said. her hands nervously twisting her apron. Quiet, yes, but she had a fire in her. You could see it in her eyes. She was smart. Too smart for this life, if you ask me. Did she get along with Mrs. Vance? Hanson asked. Mrs. Davies hesitated, her gaze flicking nervously towards the drawing-room door. As well as anyone does, she said evasively. Mrs. Vance is particular, demanding. She expects perfection. Clara gave her perfection, but it was never quite enough. Mr. Gable was even more circumspect, his loyalty to the family deeply ingrained. Miss Lawson was a competent employee, he said, his language as formal as his attire. She performed her duties to the satisfaction of the mistress of the house. But Hanson pressed him. Mr. Gable, we're trying to understand who this young woman was. Did she have any friends? A boyfriend? Did she seem happy here? The butler's composure wavered for just a second. Happy is not a word I would associate with Blackwood Manor, detective, he said, his voice dropping. We are here to work. As for friends, she kept to herself. But I did notice a change in her these past few weeks. She seemed worried, preoccupied. Worried about what? Miller asked. I couldn't say, but there was a tension between her and the mistress. You could feel it whenever they were in the same room, like the air before a thunderstorm. This was the crack Hanson had been looking for. The perfect, serene picture of Blackwood Manor was beginning to fracture. She and Miller returned to Clara's room. While the forensics team did another, more meticulous sweep, Hanson stood in the middle of the small space, trying to feel the echo of the girl who had lived and died there. She ran a gloved hand along the bookshelf. There were classic novels, a few books on art history, and, tucked behind a copy of Jane Eyre, a small plain diary. Her heart quickened. She opened it carefully. The entries were written in a neat, looping script. Most were mundane observations about her daily duties. But as Hanson flipped towards the most recent pages, the tone began to change. July 10th. She watched me again today. I was dusting the photographs on the mantelpiece ones of him. I felt her eyes on my back, cold as ice. She hates it when I look at his picture. She thinks I don't notice, but I do. I notice everything. July 18th, I found something today. In the back of the library, in an old chest. A box of letters. His letters. To someone else. I shouldn't have read them, but I did. Now I understand. I understand everything. July 24th. I have to leave. I can't stay here any longer. The air is too heavy. I feel like I can't breathe. I think she knows that I know. The way she looks at me. It's not like she's looking at a maid anymore. She's looking at something she wants to erase. The last entry was dated the day before her death. August 1st. I tried to give my notice today. I told her I was leaving at the end of the week. She didn't shout. She didn't argue. She just smiled. Tiny, cold smile. She said, "No, Clara. You won't be leaving. You belong here." It wasn't a request. It was a sentence. Hanson closed the diary, a chill running down her spine. This was no congenital heart condition. This was fear. This was a threat. "Frank," she called to her partner. "I think our wealthy widow has some more explaining to do." Just then, one of the forensic techs called out from the bedside. "Detectives, you're going to want to see this." Hanson and Miller moved to the bed. The tech was pointing at the pillow Clara's head had been resting on. It was a thick, down-filled pillow, encased in a pristine white slip. "Look," the tech said, using a pair of tweezers to lift a corner of the pillowcase. Beneath it, pressed deep into the fabric of the pillow itself, was a faint, almost invisible impression. It was the outline of a faceless silent scream, smothered into oblivion. And on the pristine white pillowcase, just next to where Clara's mouth would have been, the tech pointed to a tiny, almost microscopic fiber. It was a single, shimmering thread of dark blue silk. The exact shade as the dressing gown Eleanor Vance was still wearing. The stillness of Blackwood Manor wasn't peace. It was the suffocating silence that follows a murder. The discovery of the silk fiber and the faint impression on the pillow transformed the investigation. The quiet, sterile room was no longer just the place where Clara Lawson had died. It was the tomb where her life had been violently stolen. The official cause of death was now pending a full autopsy, but for Detectives Miller and Hansen, the preliminary findings were clear. This was a homicide, and the method was as intimate as it was brutal smothering. Asphyxiation, a crime that required proximity, strength, and an utter lack of mercy. Their focus narrowed with laser-like intensity on the lady of the manor. Eleanor Vance, with her icy composure and pronouncements of tragedy, was now their prime suspect. The challenge was to break through the formidable wall of pride, wealth, and influence she had spent a lifetime constructing around herself. They requested a second, more formal interview. This time, they didn't sit in the drawing room. At Hansen's insistence, they conducted the interview in the manor's cold, imposing dining room, seating Mrs. Vance at the head of a long, polished table, deliberately placing themselves on either side of her, disrupting her natural position of authority. Eleanor arrived, dressed in a sharp tweed suit, her expression one of weary indignation. "Detectives?" she began, her voice crisp. "I fail to see what more I can possibly tell you. It is a sad affair, but a simple one." "We're afraid it's not that simple, Mrs. Vance," Miller said, his tone flat and official. He laid a small evidence bag on the table. Inside was the single dark blue silk fiber. "Our forensics team found this on Clara's pillowcase. They've matched it to the dressing gown you were wearing yesterday morning. Can you explain how it might have gotten there?" For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed Eleanor's face. It wasn't fear or guilt. It was annoyance, as if they were children pointing out a smudge on a masterpiece. "A fiber? You are questioning me over a stray fiber?" "Detectives, this house is filled with my belongings. I employ a maid. Her entire existence was dedicated to handling my laundry, my effects. It is hardly surprising a thread might have found its way onto her uniform or her bedding." It was a plausible, almost dismissive explanation. She was using the very nature of their master-servant relationship as her defense. Hansen leaned forward, her voice soft but insistent. "We also found her diary, Mrs. Vance." The name hung in the air. Eleanor's hands, which had been resting calmly on the table, tightened into fists. "You read a servant girl's private diary? How vulgar. In it, she says she gave you her notice the day before she died," Hansen continued, ignoring the jibe. "She wrote that you told her, 'You won't be leaving. You belong here.' Is that true?" Eleanor's lips thinned into a bloodless line. The girl was emotional, overly dramatic. "She was a good maid, and I simply expressed that I did not wish for her to leave. I was attempting to reassure her, to let her know her position was secure. She was twisting my words, looking for melodrama where there was none." "She also wrote about finding some letters," Miller added, watching Eleanor's reaction closely. "Letters written by your late husband, Mr. Arthur Vance. Do you know anything about those?" The reaction was instantaneous and volcanic. Eleanor shot to her feet, her chair scraping harshly against the wooden floor. Her face, usually a pale, powdered mask, was flushed with a sudden, dark rage. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice trembling with fury. "You will not speak of my husband. You will not bring his name into this sordid mess. The girl was a thief and a liar, prying into things that were none of her concern. Get out of my house. Now, my lawyers will be in contact." She had stormed out of the room, leaving the detectives in a stunned silence. Her reaction wasn't just defensive. It was explosive. They had hit a nerve, a deep, painful one connected to her late husband and the secrets Clara had apparently unearthed. Their next step was to find those letters. Hansen remembered the diary entry. In the back of the library, in an old chest, with a search warrant in hand, they returned to the manor's library, a magnificent, two-story chamber filled with the scent of old paper and beeswax. After a meticulous search, they found Ida heavy, sea-worn trunk tucked away in a dusty alcove behind a row of encyclopedias. It was unlocked. Inside, beneath a layer of yellowed newspapers and moth-eaten blankets, was a small rosewood box. And inside the box, tied with a faded ribbon, was a stack of letters. The handwriting was a strong, masculine scrawl, the ink faded but legible. They were love letters, filled with a passion and tenderness that seemed utterly at odds with the stern, formal portraits of Arthur Vance that hung throughout the manor. But they weren't addressed to Eleanor. They were addressed to a woman named Anna. The letters spanned several years, beginning before Arthur's marriage to Eleanor and continuing for some time after. They spoke of stolen moments, of a forbidden love, of a world away from the rigid expectations of his class. They spoke of a child, a daughter. He wrote of his duty to marry Eleanor, an arranged union to merge two industrial fortunes, but his heart, he professed, would always belong to Anna. The last few letters were filled with anguish. Anna had died suddenly from a fever, leaving him to ensure their child was cared for, albeit from a distance. He had arranged for the girl to be raised by a distant cousin, providing for her financially through a discreet trust, ensuring she never knew her true parentage, to protect her from scandal and to protect his loveless, but necessary marriage. Hanson's hands were trembling as she read the final letter. In it, Arthur Vance wrote his daughter's name. It was Clara. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Clara Lawson wasn't just a maid from a working-class town. She was Arthur Vance's illegitimate daughter, the rightful heir in blood if not in name to the Vance legacy. The detectives' investigation now had a new, powerful focus. They dug into Clara's past. They found that she had been raised by a woman she knew as her aunt, who had died a few years prior. They discovered the existence of a small trust fund that had paid for her upbringing and a modest education. Clara, it seemed, had no idea about her true father. She had likely come to Blackwood Manor by sheer coincidence, seeking stable employment after her aunt's death, completely unaware that she was stepping into her father's house. But Eleanor Vance must have known, or at the very least suspected. This explained the coldness, the constant, scrutinizing watchfulness Clara had described. Eleanor wasn't just looking at a maid. She was looking at a living, breathing testament to her husband's greatest betrayal, a ghost at the feast of her perfect life. They brought Mr. Gable in for another interview, this time at the station, away from the oppressive atmosphere of the manor. They laid out the truth for him. The old butler's face, a lifetime of impassive service etched into its lines, seemed to crumble. He sank into a chair, his shoulders slumping. "I knew," he whispered, his voice thick with a grief he had held silent for decades. "I didn't know the maid was her, but I knew about Anna and the child. Mr. Vance confided in me many years ago. He was a good man, trapped by his circumstances. He loved that woman. He never loved the mistress. Their marriage was a contract." "Did Mrs. Vance know?" Hanson asked gently. "She found out," Gable said, his eyes distant. "About 10 years ago. She found a letter he had failed to destroy. I have never seen such a rage. It was quiet, you see. That's the most terrifying thing about her. Her rage is silent. She didn't scream or cry. She just went cold. Colder than she already was. She made his life a living hell in her own quiet way. She controlled everything, and she used his secret as her ultimate weapon. After he passed, she became obsessed with his memory, with preserving this perfect image of their life together. It was a lie, of course, but it was her lie. The motive was no longer just about hidden hatred. It was about pride. Eleanor Vance's entire identity was built on being the perfect wife, the matriarch of a powerful family, the sole keeper of the Vance legacy. Clara's presence, and worse, her discovery of the truth, threatened to shatter that facade. It wasn't just a personal slight. It was an existential threat to the carefully curated reality Eleanor had spent her life maintaining. "The girl, Clara," Gable continued, his voice barely audible. "When she arrived, I saw the resemblance immediately. She has her father's eyes. I think the mistress saw it too. I saw how she watched her. It was a look of pure loathing. I believe the girl figuring it out was Mrs. Vance's worst nightmare come to life." The final piece of the puzzle came from the full autopsy report. The medical examiner confirmed the cause of death was asphyxiation. But he found something else. There were faint bruises on Clara's upper arms and shoulders, consistent with someone being held down forcefully. And under her fingernails, they found microscopic traces of skin and blood. The DNA was a match. It belonged to Eleanor Vance. Clara hadn't died peacefully. She had fought back. In her final moments, the quiet, deferential Maid had fought for her life against the woman who was not only her mistress, but the jealous rival to her mother and the guardian of a truth that should have been her birthright. The cracks in the facade of Blackwood Manor had finally split wide open, revealing the ugly, rotten core beneath. Armed with the DNA evidence from under Clara's fingernails, the truth of her parentage, and the butler's damning testimony, Detectives Miller and Hanson knew they had enough to arrest Eleanor Vance. But Hanson felt a conviction was not enough. They needed a confession. They needed to hear, from the matriarch's own lips, why she had smothered the life out of her husband's daughter. It was about closing the case, but it was also about giving a voice to the silent scream they'd found imprinted on the pillow. They chose not to arrest her with a show of force at the manor. Instead, they requested her presence at the station, a sterile, neutral ground where her title of Mrs. Vance held no power and the walls were not her own. They expected her to arrive with a team of high-priced lawyers. She arrived alone. She walked into the interrogation room as if she were entering her own drawing room for afternoon tea. She wore a Chanel suit the color of cream. Her silver hair was perfect, and her posture was unwavering. She sat down opposite them, placing her leather handbag on the table with a soft, definitive click. "I assume this is the part where you attempt to intimidate me," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. Miller slid a file across the table. It was the DNA report. "There's no intimidation necessary, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice weary. "Just facts. We found your skin and blood under Clara Lawson's fingernails." She fought back. Eleanor glanced at the report, her expression unchanged. She didn't deny it. She didn't feign surprise. She simply raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. She was surprisingly strong for such a little thing. A regrettable lack of decorum, I must say. But then, what can one expect from that kind of breeding? The casual cruelty of the statement hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Hanson felt a surge of anger but kept her voice level. "We know who she was, Eleanor," she said, using her first name for the first time. "We know she was Arthur's daughter." The use of her name seemed to be the only thing that could pierce her armor. A muscle in her jaw twitched. "So the little sneak told you. I suspected as much." "She didn't tell us," Hanson corrected her. "We found the letters. She never knew her father was Arthur Vance. She came to your house by accident. A coincidence that signed her death warrant." Eleanor Vance was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on some distant point. The detectives waited, letting the weight of the truth settle. When she finally spoke, her voice was stripped of its aristocratic affectation. It was raw, cold, and filled with a hatred that seemed ancient. "Coincidence?" she mused, a bitter smile touching her lips. "I don't believe in coincidences. I believe it was a final, posthumous insult from my husband, sending his bastard to my very door, to serve me, to handle my things, to breathe my air. He was mocking me, even from the grave." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Hanson's. "You have no idea what my life was. You see this house, this name, and you think you understand. You understand nothing. My marriage was a business transaction. I provided him with a respectable wife, a hostess, an heir to the Vance name, though God, in his infinite cruelty, saw fit to deny me even that. In return, I was to have the security and prestige of being Mrs. Arthur Vance. That was the deal. But he broke the contract. He gave his love, his heart, to some common woman. He gave her a child. He gave her the one thing he never gave me." Her confession began to pour out, not as an apology, but as a justification. It was a litany of perceived injustices, a lifetime of simmering resentment that had been brought to a boil by Clara's arrival. "When she first came to the manor, I saw it in her eyes," Eleanor said. His eyes, looking at me. Every day was a torment. Every time she handed me a cup of tea, I saw her mother's hands. Every time she spoke, I heard a voice that should never have existed. She was a stain on my life, on my legacy. The legacy I had suffered in silence for 50 years to protect. She described the final confrontation with chilling precision. Clara had come to her in the study the night before she died, clutching the rosewood box of letters. She was shaking, Eleanor recounted, a note of contempt in her voice. She said she was sorry, that she never meant to pry. She didn't understand what the letters meant. Not fully, but she knew they were a secret. She just wanted to leave, to walk away and pretend none of it had ever happened. Eleanor had forbidden it. To her, Clara leaving was not an escape, but a liability. The secret would walk out of the door with her. The story of Arthur Vance's affair could, at any moment, be exposed. She was a loose thread, Eleanor said simply, and I have always hated loose threads. They unravel the entire tapestry. Later that night, long after the house had fallen silent, Eleanor had gone to Clara's room. She hadn't planned it, not in a conscious way. It was, she described, an impulse born of a lifetime of suppressed rage. She walked into the room and saw the girl asleep, her face peaceful, looking so much like him in repose. And in that moment, Eleanor whispered, her eyes glowing with a strange cold fire. All I could think was that she had no right to that peace. She had no right to exist. Her mother had stolen my husband's love, and she, this girl, had stolen my peace of mind. She was the final insult. So I erased her. She described taking the pillow. Clara had woken as she pressed down, her eyes wide with terror and disbelief. The struggle was brief but violent. Eleanor, fueled by decades of hatred, was relentless. When it was over, she concluded, leaning back in her chair, her composure fully restored. The house was finally quiet again. I tidied the room. I straightened her blanket. I restored order. It's what I've always done. There was no remorse in her voice, no guilt, only the profound, unshakable conviction of her own righteousness. In her mind, she had not committed a murder. She had performed a necessary, if unpleasant, act of housekeeping. She had protected the Vance name, the only thing she had ever truly loved. Eleanor Vance was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the trial, she remained a figure of icy disdain, her pride intact even as the sordid details of her life were laid bare for the world to see. She never once showed emotion, not even when the judge read her sentence. Blackwood Manor was sold, its contents auctioned off. The Vance dynasty, built on industry and maintained by pride, ended not with a bang, but with the quiet, pathetic confession of a lonely, hateful old woman. Detective Hansen visited the manor one last time before it was shuttered. She walked through the empty, echoing rooms, stripped of their grandeur, and thought of the two women whose lives had been destroyed within them. She thought of Eleanor, imprisoned by her own hatred, and of Clara, the girl who had unknowingly walked into her own grave, a victim of a war that had begun long before she was born. Looking out of the library window at the misty river below, Hansen realized the true motive wasn't just pride or hatred. It was fear, the terrifying fear of being seen for what you truly are. Eleanor Vance had spent her life constructing a perfect facade, and she had killed to protect it. But in the end, by smothering the life out of the girl who was her husband's greatest secret, she had only succeeded in exposing her own monstrous soul to the world. The house was empty now, but the ugly truth of what had happened there would haunt its walls forever.